November 12, 1943. A farmhouse clinic outside Eindhoven, in the occupied Netherlands. Rain fell steadily on the clay-tiled roof, each drop a soft percussion against the silence of the countryside. Inside, Anna de Vries stood at a porcelain basin, washing her hands in water so cold it stung. The soap, a grey sliver she had stretched across 3 weeks, barely produced lather. She scrubbed anyway, methodically, the way she had been taught at St. Elizabeth Hospital before the war, before the occupation, before the world had divided itself into categories that made no sense to her hands. Through the window, she could see the dull shapes of apple trees, their branches bare and black against the November sky. Beyond them, the road. Always the road. German trucks passed daily now, their engines grinding through gears as they carried troops toward the Western Front. Sometimes they stopped. Sometimes soldiers knocked. She always answered, her face carefully neutral, her Dutch accent thick enough to suggest ignorance of German, though she understood every word. The clinic had been her father's. He had been a country doctor, loved for his patients and disliked for his refusal to turn anyone away. When tuberculosis took him in 1941, Anna inherited not just the building but the burden of his principles. She was 26 years old, trained as a surgical nurse, and suddenly responsible for an entire district's medical needs. The German authorities permitted her to continue because rural areas needed medical personnel, and because she had signed the required forms, the ones that acknowledged occupation law and forbade treating enemies of the Reich. She had signed. Everyone had signed. Survival required it. Her clinic served farmers, children with fevers, elderly women whose joints ached in the damp. She set bones, delivered babies, drained infections, and dispensed the meager medicines she could still acquire. Morphine was nearly impossible to obtain. Sulfa drugs came rarely, and only through black market channels she pretended not to know about. She made do with boiled instruments, herb poultices, and the kind of improvisation that defined medicine under occupation. The room smelled of carbolic acid and damp wool. A single oil lamp burned on her desk, its flame barely pushing back the afternoon gloom. Electricity was rationed, and she saved it for emergencies. This was not an emergency. Not yet. She dried her hands on a cloth that had been white once, before years of washing in cold water and lye soap had turned it the color of old bone. On the wall above the basin hung a framed certificate from the Royal Dutch Nursing Association, dated 1938. It bore her name in careful script and declared that she had sworn to care for the sick without distinction of nationality, race, or creed. She looked at it sometimes, late at night, when the choices became too heavy. The words had meant something once. She wasn't sure what they meant now. Outside, a dog barked. Then another. Anna's hands stilled. Dogs didn't bark at trucks. They barked at strangers on foot, at people trying not to be seen. She moved to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain. The road was empty. The fields beyond were grey with rain. Nothing moved except the wind through the grass. She returned to her desk and opened the ledger where she recorded every patient, every treatment, every gram of medicine dispensed. The Germans inspected it monthly. They looked for irregularities, for signs that she might be treating partisans or Jews or anyone who fell outside the narrow definition of acceptable suffering. She had learned to write carefully, to omit names when necessary, to record only what could not be questioned. The occupation had taught her many things. How to stretch bandages by cutting them thinner. How to recognize the sound of Gestapo boots on cobblestone. How to lie with her face. How to weigh the life of one patient against the safety of a dozen others. These were not lessons taught in nursing school, but they were the curriculum of survival, and she had become an unwilling expert. The rain grew heavier. Water pooled in the yard, turning the dirt to mud. Anna lit a second lamp, this one in the examination room. The table there was narrow, covered with a sheet that had been boiled so many times the cotton was nearly transparent. Beside it stood a cabinet containing her instruments, forceps, scalpels, scissors, all sterilized and wrapped in cloth. She checked them reflexively, though she had checked them an hour before. Routine was a defense against chaos. As long as she followed the rituals of medicine, she could pretend the world still made sense. Her father used to say that a doctor's duty transcended politics. He had treated German soldiers and Dutch resistance fighters with equal care, never asking questions, never demanding explanations. The Gestapo had questioned him twice. The second time, they had threatened him. A week later, his tuberculosis worsened. Anna never knew if the timing was coincidence or consequence, but she suspected the stress had weakened him beyond recovery. His last words to her had been simple, "Do no harm." She had promised. But promises made in peacetime felt different under occupation, when doing no harm to one person might mean doing great harm to many others. Every choice rippled outward. Every act of mercy created risk. She had learned to calculate those risks, to weigh lives like a merchant weighing grain, and she hated herself for it. The dogs barked again, closer now. Anna's pulse quickened. She moved to the door, hand on the latch, listening. Footsteps. Uneven, dragging. Someone was hurt. She opened the door. At first, she saw only shadow, a figure collapsed against the stone wall of her courtyard, soaked through, breathing in short, harsh gasps. Then she saw the uniform, or what remained of it, dark wool, torn and muddy, but unmistakably military. Not German. Not Dutch. The insignia on the shoulder was faint, but she recognized it, RAF. Royal Air Force. British. Her breath caught. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door, to pretend she had seen nothing, to protect herself and her clinic and the people who depended on her. But the man's face was turned toward her, pale and twisted with pain, and his eyes were open, watching her. Pleading without words. Anna's hands moved before her mind could stop them. She stepped out into the rain, hooked her arms under his shoulders, and dragged him inside. He was heavier than he looked, deadweight except for the faint tremor of consciousness. Blood soaked through his shirt, dark and wet, spreading across her floor as she pulled him toward the examination room. She locked the door behind her. Then she stood there, rain dripping from her hair, staring at the man on her floor, and understood that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The examination room was colder than the rest of the clinic, its stone floor sucking warmth from the air. Anna knelt beside the airman, her hands already assessing. His breathing was shallow, rapid. His pulse fluttered beneath her fingertips, too fast, too weak. Shock. Blood loss. Possibly infection. She had seen wounds like this before, but never on someone whose presence could destroy her. She forced herself to focus. A patient was a patient. That's what her father had taught her. Nationality was irrelevant in the face of suffering. But even as she repeated the words in her mind, another voice whispered back, "This is different. This is an enemy of the Reich. This is death if you're caught." His uniform was shredded, burned in places. She smelled fuel and smoke and something else, cordite, perhaps, or the scorched metal of a downed aircraft. His left leg was the problem. The trouser was soaked through, and when she cut away the fabric, she found a deep gash along the thigh, jagged and filthy with debris. Shrapnel, most likely. The edges of the wound were inflamed, already showing signs of infection. Without treatment, gangrene would set in within days. She stood and gathered supplies, boiled water, clean rags, the last vial of sulfa powder she had been saving for emergencies. This qualified. If it didn't, nothing did. She returned and began cleaning the wound, irrigating it with water and iodine, picking out fragments of metal and cloth with forceps. The man groaned but did not wake. His face was young, mid-20s perhaps, with a jaw that hadn't been shaved in days and dark circles beneath his eyes. Who was he? A bomber pilot shot down over Dutch airspace? A gunner who had bailed out before his aircraft exploded? She didn't know, and she couldn't ask. He was unconscious, and even if he woke, they shared no common language beyond the universal grammar of pain and relief. She worked quickly, methodically, her training taking over. The wound cleaned, she dusted it with sulfa powder, precious, irreplaceable sulfa powder, and began stitching. Her sutures were small and precise, the kind her father had taught her to do by lamplight when electricity was unreliable. Each stitch pulled the torn flesh together, each knot tied with care. Medicine was the only part of her life that still made sense. Here, there were rules. Here, she could control outcomes. Here, skill mattered more than politics. When the leg was bandaged, she turned her attention to the rest of him. A cracked rib, possibly two, judging by the way he flinched when she pressed his side. Bruises across his back and shoulders, mottled purple and green. Burns on his hands, first degree, painful but not dangerous. Dehydration. Exhaustion. Nothing else immediately life-threatening, but enough to keep him bedridden for days, perhaps weeks. She covered him with a blanket and sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how much she was trembling. Her hands were steady when she worked, they always were, but now, with nothing left to do, the enormity of what she had done crashed over her like a wave. She had treated an enemy combatant. She had used medicine intended for her patients to save a British airman. If the Germans found out, they would arrest her. If the neighbors found out, they might turn her in, either out of fear or ideology or the promise of reward. And yet, the alternative had been to let him die on her doorstep. That, too, was a choice. A choice to do nothing, which was still a choice, and one she could not live with. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, "Do no harm." But what was harm in a world where mercy itself was criminal? She stood and checked the windows, ensuring the curtains were drawn. The rain continued, a steady drumbeat that would cover sound if he woke and cried out. Good. The fewer people who heard anything unusual, the better. She lit another lamp and placed it near the examination table, then pulled up a chair. She would stay with him tonight, monitoring his condition, ready to intervene if the infection spread or his breathing worsened. Sleep was not an option. Vigilance was. Hours passed. The airman's breathing evened out, deeper and slower, no longer the harsh gasps of shock. His pulse steadied. The sulfa powder was working. She allowed herself a small measure of relief, though she knew it was premature. Even if he survived the wound, the greater danger was still to come. He could not stay here indefinitely. Sooner or later, someone would notice. The Germans, the neighbors, the local collaborators who reported anything suspicious in exchange for rations or favor. She had no plan. That was the most terrifying part. She had acted on instinct, and now she was trapped in the consequences of that instinct. She could not take him to a hospital. Hospitals reported all gunshot and shrapnel wounds to the occupation authorities. She could not ask for help. Every person she involved became another liability, another risk, another life endangered by her choice. She was alone with this, as she had been alone with so much else since her father died. The lamp flickered, its oil running low. She refilled it from a tin she kept in the corner, careful not to spill. Oil was rationed, like everything else, and waste was not something she could afford. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. In silence, every sound became a threat, a creak of floorboards, a dog barking in the distance, the rumble of a truck on the road. She looked at the man on her table. In sleep, his face was peaceful, almost boyish. He had a scar on his chin, faint and old, and his hands were calloused, the hands of someone who worked with tools or machinery. A pilot, then, or a mechanic. Someone who had lived a life before the war, who had laughed and loved and dreamed, and who now lay in a stranger's clinic, dependent on her silence for his survival. Anna thought of the oath she had taken, the one framed on her wall. She had promised to care for the sick without distinction. She had not promised to be a hero. She had not promised to risk everything. But here she was, and the line between duty and martyrdom had blurred so completely that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Outside, the world slept, or pretended to. Inside, Anna sat vigil, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing through scenarios she could not control. And on the table, the enemy breathed, unaware that his life now rested in the hands of a woman who had every reason to turn him away and one impossible reason not to. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of dawn that offered no comfort. Anna had not slept. She sat in the chair beside the examination table, watching the rise and fall of the airman's chest, listening for changes in his breathing. He had not woken, which was both a relief and a concern. Unconsciousness protected him from pain, but it also kept him from telling her what had happened, where he had come from, whether anyone else knew he was here. At 6 o'clock, she rose stiffly and went to the window. The courtyard was empty, the fields beyond still. No sign of German patrols, no trucks on the road. Sunday morning. The occupation authorities were less vigilant on Sundays, or so people said. Anna didn't trust it. The Germans were methodical, and their schedules shifted without warning. Complacency was as dangerous as carelessness. She returned to the examination room and checked the airman's wound. The bandage was clean, no fresh bleeding, and the skin around the stitches showed no red streaks. The sulfa powder had done its work. She changed the dressing anyway, using the last of her sterile gauze. Tomorrow she would need to find more, and finding more meant contacting the black market pharmacist in Eindhoven, which meant risk and questions she couldn't answer. The airman stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. He stared at the ceiling, confused, his gaze unfocused. Then his eyes found her, and fear flickered across his face. He tried to sit up, gasped in pain, and fell back. "Easy," Anna said in Dutch, her voice low and steady. "You're safe. Don't move." He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He looked at her, then at the bandage on his leg, then back at her. His lips moved, forming a question he couldn't voice. "Who are you? Where am I? Why are you helping me?" She pointed to herself. "Anna." Then to him, raising her eyebrows in question. "James," he managed, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Flight Lieutenant James Harper." "RAF." She nodded, though the information meant nothing to her except danger. A name made him real, made him someone's son, someone's brother, someone who would be mourned if he died. It also made him a liability she couldn't afford to think about. She brought him water, holding the cup to his lips while he drank. He winced with every swallow, and she saw that his throat was raw, probably from smoke inhalation. When he had drunk enough, she set the cup aside and gestured for him to lie still. He obeyed, too weak to argue. For the next 3 days, they lived in a strange, silent partnership. Anna cared for him as she would any patient, changing his bandages, monitoring his temperature, feeding him broth and bread when he was strong enough to eat. He asked no questions, offered no explanations. Perhaps he understood that silence was safer. Perhaps he was simply too exhausted to speak. Either way, the quiet suited her. But on the 4th day, reality intruded. It began with a knock at the door. Anna froze, her hand still on the airman's forehead, checking for fever. The knock came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice she recognized, Peter van Dyke, the village constable. "Anna. Open up. I need to speak with you." She looked at James. His eyes were wide, alert, understanding immediately that this was not a friendly visit. She pressed a finger to her lips, then moved quickly to the examination room door, closing it behind her. She took a breath, smoothed her apron, and walked to the front door. Peter stood on the step, his uniform damp from the morning mist. He was a thin man, his face lined with worry and exhaustion. Before the war, he had been a kind man, the sort who warned children away from trouble instead of arresting them. The occupation had hardened him, or perhaps it had simply revealed what he had always been, someone who followed orders because he feared the consequences of not following them. "Peter," she said, her voice calm. "What brings you here? May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered, removing his cap, and looked around the clinic with the careful scrutiny of a man searching for something specific. Anna's heart pounded, but she kept her face neutral. "I'll be brief," Peter said. "A German patrol found wreckage of a British bomber 2 days ago, about 15 kilometers south. They've been searching the area for survivors. One airman is missing. They think he may be hiding nearby." Anna's hands clenched at her sides, but she forced them to relax. "I haven't seen anyone. They're checking every house, every barn, every clinic." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Anna, if you've seen anything unusual, you need to tell me. The Germans aren't patient with this sort of thing." "I understand. But I've seen nothing." Peter studied her for a long moment, and she wondered if he believed her. Then he nodded slowly. "Good. Because if they find someone hiding here, they won't just arrest you. They'll burn the clinic and arrest everyone who's come here in the past month. They'll call it aiding the enemy, and they'll make an example. I know what they do, Peter. Do you?" His voice softened. "Your father was a good man, Anna. He helped people. But this isn't that world anymore. This is survival. And survival means knowing when to turn away." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't incriminate her. Peter put his cap back on and moved toward the door. Then he stopped. I grew up on your father's stories about the oath. About treating everyone the same, no matter who they were. I admired that. But the Germans don't care about oaths. They care about compliance. Remember that. He left. Anna closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He knew. He hadn't said it, but he knew. And he had given her a warning disguised as a reminder. The question was whether he would report her or whether his silence was a gift, one that could be revoked at any moment. She returned to the examination room. James was sitting up, his face pale. I heard, he said in halting Dutch, words he must have learned from someone, somewhere. I go. You, safe. She shook her head. You can't walk. And they're searching. You'd be caught in an hour. Then what? She looked at him, at the wound that was just beginning to heal, at the burns on his hands and the fear in his eyes. And she made the second choice that would define everything that came after. There's a cellar, she said. My father used it for storage. It's small, but it's hidden. You'll stay there until the searches end. Why? He asked, the question simple and enormous. Why help? Anna thought of her father's framed certificate, of the oath she had taken, of the line between duty and self-destruction. She thought of Peter's warning and the German patrols and the very real possibility that this act of mercy would cost her everything. Because, she said finally, some choices you can't take back. And I've already made mine. The cellar was older than the clinic itself, carved into the earth before the house had been built above it. Anna's father had used it to store root vegetables and preserves, and later, medical supplies that didn't need to be displayed openly. Now it held a wounded British airman, a wooden crate for a bed, and 3 days' worth of dread compressed into darkness. Anna had moved him there the night after Peter's visit, half carrying, half dragging him down the narrow stone steps. The effort left them both exhausted, James grey-faced with pain, Anna trembling with fear. She had covered the cellar entrance with a rug and pushed her desk over it, the wood scraping against the floor in a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The space below was barely 2 meters square, with a ceiling so low James couldn't stand upright. She had brought him blankets, a bucket, a small oil lamp she warned him to use sparingly. Ventilation came through a narrow gap near the foundation, a crack no wider than her hand. Enough air to breathe, but not enough to dispel the smell of earth and damp and the faint metallic tang of old blood. Every morning she moved the desk, lifted the rug, and descended with food and water. Every evening she checked his wound, changed his bandages, and listened to his breathing in the dark. They spoke little. Words were dangerous, and besides, what was there to say? They were caught in a shared trap, and every hour that passed tightened the noose. On the 6th day, the German patrol arrived. Anna heard them before she saw them, the rumble of a truck, the bark of orders in German, boots on gravel. She was in the clinic's main room, organizing medicines she had already organized twice that morning, when the door burst open without a knock. 3 soldiers entered, their rifles slung but ready. Behind them came an officer, his uniform crisp despite the mud outside, his face sharp and unreadable. He looked around the clinic with the methodical gaze of a man trained to notice inconsistencies. Fräulein de Vries. His Dutch was accented but precise. Yes. I am Hauptmann Richter. We are conducting searches for an enemy airman. You have been informed of this? Constable Van Dyke mentioned it. Good. Then you will not mind if we look. It wasn't a question. Anna stepped aside, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their shaking. The soldiers moved through the clinic with brutal efficiency, opening cabinets, checking behind curtains, appending furniture. One of them knocked over a jar of cotton swabs, scattering them across the floor. He didn't apologize. Hauptmann Richter walked slowly, his eyes scanning every surface. He paused at her father's certificate, reading the Dutch words with apparent interest. Then he turned to her. You are a nurse. Yes. Trained where? St. Elizabeth Hospital. Amsterdam. And you work here alone? Since my father's death, yes. He nodded, as if confirming something. Your father was a doctor, I'm told. A man of principles. Anna's pulse quickened. He believed in helping people. Even enemies of the Reich. The question hung between them, sharp and deliberate. Anna met his gaze and lied with the same calm expression she used when recording false entries in her ledger. He believed in helping patients. Politics were beyond his concern. And you? Are politics beyond your concern as well? I treat farmers and children, Hauptmann. I don't have the luxury of politics. A faint smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. A wise answer. He continued his inspection, moving into the examination room. Anna followed, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. The desk was in place over the cellar entrance, the rug smooth beneath it. But what if they looked closer? What if they moved the desk? What if James made a sound, coughed, shifted position? One of the soldiers opened the medical cabinet, rifling through instruments. Another checked the window, testing the latch. Hauptmann Richter stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping across the table, the shelves, the floor. He knelt and ran his hand along the stone, and Anna's breath stopped. Then he stood. Nothing here. Relief flooded through her, so intense she thought her knees might buckle. But Richter wasn't finished. He walked to the desk, placed his hand on it, and looked at Anna. This is quite heavy. What do you keep in it? Ledgers. Records of patients and treatments. The occupation authorities require thorough documentation. Yes. They do. He drummed his fingers on the desk once, twice. Then he turned away. We will search the grounds as well. Stay inside. They left the examination room, and Anna heard them moving through the rest of the clinic, then outside to the courtyard and the barn. She remained where she was, afraid to move, afraid that any change in her posture or expression would betray her. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. Finally, boots on gravel. The truck engine starting. Hauptmann Richter appeared in the doorway one last time. Fräulein de Vries, a word of advice. The Reich rewards those who cooperate and punishes those who deceive. If you see anything unusual, report it. It will go better for you. I understand. I hope you do. He left. The truck pulled away, its engine fading into the distance. Only then did Anna allow herself to move. She locked the door, closed the curtains, and stood in the center of the room, her hands pressed to her face. She had survived the search. But survival felt less like victory and more like postponement. That night, she moved the desk and descended into the cellar. James was awake, sitting against the wall, his face gaunt in the lamplight. They came, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And they found nothing. Not yet. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the same understanding she felt. This couldn't last. The searches would continue. Patrols would return. Someone, eventually, would notice something, a missing ration, an extra footprint, a sound in the night. And when they did, both of their lives would end. I should go, James said. Tonight. Before it's too late. You can barely walk. I'll manage. You won't. And when they catch you, they'll trace you back here. They'll ask where you've been, and even if you don't tell them, they'll guess. It's too late for that choice. Silence filled the cellar, heavy and suffocating. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Then what do we do? Anna had no answer. She checked his wound, changed his bandage, and left him in the dark. As she climbed the stairs and replaced the rug, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down like the earth above the cellar, immovable and absolute. She had sworn an oath to do no harm. But every day she kept James Harper alive, she risked harm to everyone around her. And every day she considered turning him over to the Germans, she felt something inside her die, something that had to do with the kind of person she wanted to be, the kind her father had believed she was. The clinic was silent. The night pressed against the windows. And somewhere beneath her feet, a man she barely knew lay hidden, his life and hers now bound together by a decision neither of them could undo. 11 days after Peter's warning, the betrayal came from an unexpected direction. Her name was Greta Hoffmann, a widow in her 50s who lived 2 farms over. She had been a patient of Anna's father, then of Anna herself, chronic arthritis, treated with aspirin and warm compresses when those were available, treated with reassurance and patience when they were not. Greta was German by birth but had married a Dutch farmer before the war and stayed after his death. She existed in the gray space between occupier and occupied, trusted by neither, tolerated by both. She arrived at the clinic on a Wednesday morning, her face pinched with pain. Anna let her in, prepared a compress, and asked the routine questions about sleep and diet and whether the pain had worsened. Greta answered in clipped sentences, her eyes darting around the room with unusual nervousness. "You seem troubled," Anna said, her hands working the compress. "Is something wrong beyond the arthritis?" Greta was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I saw lights." Anna's hands stilled. "Lights? At night? Coming from your cellar window?" "Just a flicker, but I saw it." Greta's voice was thin, almost apologetic. "I wasn't spying. I couldn't sleep because of the pain, and I was walking in the garden when I noticed." The air in the room seemed to contract. Anna continued working the compress, her face neutral, her mind racing. "The cellar window faces away from your farm. I walked farther than usual. Restless, you understand." "I see." Anna tied off the compress and stepped back. "What you saw was probably me, looking for supplies. I store medicine down there. At midnight? Sleep doesn't come easily these days." Greta's eyes met hers, and in them Anna saw something she hadn't expected, not accusation, but fear. "Anna, you must understand. My position here is difficult. I am German, but I am also not one of them. They watch me. They question my loyalty. If I know something and don't report it." The threat hung unspoken. Anna sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, her mind calculating outcomes. Greta was right about her position. The Germans didn't trust ethnic Germans who had married locals, such people were seen as potentially compromised, their loyalties uncertain. And uncertain people reported things to prove themselves. "What do you want?" Anna asked quietly. "I want to be wrong." Greta's voice cracked. "I want to believe that what I saw was nothing." "But Anna, they're searching everywhere. They've arrested 3 people in the village for hiding food illegally. If someone is hiding more than food, if they find out I knew and said nothing. Are you asking me to confirm what you suspect? I'm asking you to give me a reason not to report what I saw." The words settled between them like stones. Anna looked at this woman, this frightened widow whose arthritis she had treated for 2 years, whose loneliness she had eased with conversation, whose survival in occupied territory was as precarious as her own. And she understood that there was no right answer, no clever argument that would satisfy both Greta's fear and her own conscience. "If you report it," Anna said carefully, "you'll have to be certain. Because if you're wrong, you'll have caused harm for nothing. And if you're right." She paused. "If you're right, you'll have to live with what comes after." Greta stood, the compress forgotten. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this. None of us do. But I can't risk my own safety for yours. I can't. I'm not asking you to." They looked at each other, and Anna saw the exact moment Greta made her decision. It was visible in the way her shoulders straightened, the way her jaw set, the way her eyes hardened with the terrible resolve of someone choosing survival over empathy. "I'm sorry," Greta said. Then she left. Anna remained seated, her mind eerily calm despite the catastrophe unfolding. She had perhaps 2 hours, maybe less, before Greta spoke to the authorities. 2 hours to decide whether to run, to hide James more effectively, or to face what was coming with whatever dignity she could muster. She descended to the cellar. James was sitting up, having heard voices and understood nothing except the tension in them. "We have a problem," Anna said in English, words she had learned from him over the past days. She explained. James listened, his face grave. When she finished, he said, "I'll go. Now. Give me clothes, civilian clothes, and I'll go. They won't connect you to me if I'm not here. They'll search the cellar. They'll find evidence, bandages, the blankets, your uniform. Burn them. Burn everything. There's no time. And even if there were, Greta knows what she saw. She'll tell them about the lights. They'll investigate." James leaned forward, his hands on his knees. "Then I'll confess I broke in. I'll say I threatened you, forced you to treat me. They'll believe it. They won't. They know I had opportunities to report you. Peter came. The patrol searched. I said nothing. Then what? Anna sat down on the crate that had served as his bed. She felt exhausted, not the physical exhaustion of sleepless nights, but the deeper exhaustion of choices that offered no good outcomes. I don't know. They sat in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down like the earth above. Anna thought of her father, of his refusal to turn anyone away, of the way he had died, whether from illness or from the stress of living according to principles the occupation didn't permit. She thought of her oath, of the certificate on her wall, of the person she had believed herself to be before the war forced her to become someone else. I would do it again, she said suddenly, surprising herself. James looked at her. What? If I had known this would happen, the searches, the fear, this moment, I would still have brought you inside. I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. That's madness. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's the only thing that makes sense when nothing else does. Upstairs, a sound. Boots on gravel. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Anna and James looked at each other, and in his eyes she saw something unexpected, not fear, but gratitude. Thank you, he said. For seeing me as human when you didn't have to. She nodded, unable to speak. Then she climbed the stairs, closed the cellar entrance behind her, and moved the desk back into place. By the time the pounding came at the door, she was standing in the clinic's main room, her hands steady, her face composed. She opened the door. Hauptmann Richter stood there, flanked by soldiers. His expression was unreadable. Fräulein de Vries, he said. We need to talk. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single bulb that hung from the ceiling like an accusation. Anna sat in a wooden chair, her hands on the table, her posture straight despite the hours that had passed since they had brought her here. Hauptmann Richter sat across from her, a file open in front of him, though he rarely looked at it. He already knew what he needed to know. Let us be clear, he said in German, then repeated it in Dutch, ensuring she understood. Harboring an enemy combatant is punishable by death. Do you understand this? I understand. Good. Then you will also understand that cooperation is your only path to leniency. I have cooperated. I answered your questions. You have answered some questions. Not all. He leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Flight Lieutenant James Harper was found in your cellar, hidden beneath your examination room. The cellar showed evidence of occupancy, blankets, a lamp, medical supplies. You claim he broke in and threatened you. Is that correct? Yes. And yet, when my men searched your clinic days ago, you said nothing. When Constable Van Dyke warned you, you said nothing. Why? I was afraid. Afraid of what? A wounded man who could barely walk. Anna met his gaze. Afraid of what you would do if you thought I was involved. So you were afraid of the consequences of helping him, yet you helped him anyway. I treated his wound because I am a nurse. That is what I do. Under threat? Yes. Richter smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. Fräulein de Vries, I have conducted many interrogations. I know the difference between truth and performance. You are intelligent, educated, trained in a profession that values life. I do not believe you acted under duress. I believe you acted from principle. Believe what you like. He stood and walked to the corner of the room, his back to her. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost conversational. Your father was also a man of principle. We questioned him about treating partisans. He refused to confirm or deny. He invoked his oath, his duty. It was admirable, in a way. Foolish, but admirable. Anna's hands tightened on the table. My father died of illness. Did he? Richter turned back to face her. Or did he die because men of principle often burn themselves out in systems that do not accommodate them? What do you want from me, Hauptmann? I want the truth. Not the story you've prepared, but the actual truth. Why did you help him? Anna was silent. She had prepared for this question, had rehearsed answers that might satisfy a German officer, but now, faced with Richter's calm insistence, she found herself stripped of pretense. Because I took an oath. To help those who suffer, without distinction. That oath does not apply in wartime. It applies to me. Richter studied her for a long moment. Then he sat down again, closing the file. Flight Lieutenant Harper has been taken into custody. He corroborated your story, claimed he threatened you, forced you to treat him. He was quite insistent about it. Dramatic, even. Then you have your answer. Except that I don't believe him either. The sulfa powder you used on his wound, we tracked the purchase to a black market pharmacist in Eindhoven. You acquired it 3 weeks ago, long before Harper's aircraft was shot down. You were saving it for someone. Why use it on a man who threatened you? Anna said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't incriminate her further. Richter opened the file again, though he didn't look at it. I have a decision to make, Fräulein de Vries. I can recommend your execution for treason. The evidence is sufficient, and the law is clear. Or I can acknowledge that you are a medical professional acting according to training that predates this war, training that does not distinguish between nationalities. The Reich needs medical personnel. Rural areas especially. Your skills are useful. What are you saying? I am saying that usefulness can mitigate principle. If you agree to continue your work under stricter oversight, if you agree to report any suspicious activity, any sign of resistance or aid to enemies, you may continue practicing. Your clinic will remain open. You will survive. And if I refuse? Then you will not. The choice was laid before her with brutal simplicity. Survival in exchange for complicity. Freedom in exchange for silence. She thought of the certificate on her wall, of her father's voice, of the line she had already crossed by treating James Harper. She thought of the patients who depended on her, the children she had delivered, the infections she had drained, the lives that would be lost if the clinic closed. I want to see him, she said quietly. Flight Lieutenant Harper. Richter raised an eyebrow. Why? Because I want to know if what I did was worth it. He considered this, then nodded. Very well. 5 minutes. They brought James to a different room, his hands cuffed, his face bruised. A guard stood by the door, rifle ready. Richter remained in the corner, observing. James looked at Anna, and she saw in his eyes the same exhaustion she felt. I told them it wasn't your fault, he said in halting Dutch. I know. They didn't believe me. It doesn't matter what they believe. Only what they can prove. I'm sorry. If I hadn't. Don't. Anna's voice was firm. You were wounded. I'm a nurse. That's all there is to it. Richter cleared his throat. Your 5 minutes are almost up. Anna looked at James, this stranger for whom she had risked everything, and felt no regret. Only a strange, quiet certainty that some choices transcended survival, that some acts mattered more than their consequences. What will happen to you? She asked. Prisoner of war camp. If I'm lucky. And if you're not? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both understood the possibilities. Your father, James said suddenly. The certificate on your wall. That oath you took. I read it while I was hiding. It said, without distinction. You kept that promise. Whatever happens to you, know that. The guard stepped forward. Time's up. James was led away. Anna watched him go, then turned to Richter. I'll take your offer. You'll report suspicious activity. I'll report medical cases to your office monthly. That's all I'm willing to do. Richter smiled faintly. I expected nothing more. You are your father's daughter, after all. Anna returned to the clinic 3 days later, escorted by a soldier who made a show of inspecting the premises before leaving her alone. The desk had been moved, the cellar emptied and cleaned. The medical cabinet had been reorganized according to German standards, with all narcotics and controlled substances tagged and logged. A new lock had been installed on the door, and Hauptmann Richter had kept one of the keys. She stood in the examination room, looking at the table where she had first treated James Harper's wound. The table was bare now, scrubbed clean, the sheet replaced. It looked exactly as it had before he arrived, as if the past 2 weeks had been a dream. But the changes were deeper than what could be cleaned. The clinic felt different now, watched, violated, no longer entirely her own. That first night back, she lay in her bed upstairs, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She kept hearing sounds, footsteps in the courtyard, a cough from the cellar, the rumble of a truck on the road. Phantom echoes of a danger that had passed but left its mark. She wondered if she would ever feel safe here again, or if safety itself was a concept that belonged to a world before the war, a world she could no longer return to. The village treated her differently. Some patients stopped coming, avoiding her clinic as if her choices might contaminate them. Others came more frequently, their faces sympathetic but cautious, as if testing whether she was still trustworthy. Peter Van Dyke visited once, standing awkwardly in her doorway, and told her that Greta Hoffmann had moved away, gone to stay with relatives in Germany. Whether she left by choice or under pressure, he didn't say. Anna didn't ask. But not everyone turned away. A week after her release, an elderly farmer arrived with his grandson, a boy of 8 who had fallen from a barn loft and broken his arm. The farmer looked at Anna, his weathered face unreadable, and said simply, "My grandson needs help." She set the bone, fashioned a splint from the materials she had left, and wrapped it carefully. The boy cried but tried to be brave. When she finished, the farmer placed a small sack on her desk. Inside were 3 eggs, a luxury in occupied territory. "Payment," he said. "That's too much." "No, it isn't." He looked at her directly. "My brother fought in the Great War. He was captured by the Germans. They treated him well, sent him home in 1918. He always said someone showed him mercy when they didn't have to. I reckon that's worth remembering." Anna accepted the eggs, her throat tight. The farmer and his grandson left, and she stood alone in the clinic, holding the small sack, feeling the weight of generosity in a world that offered so little of it. The war continued. 1943 became 1944, and 1944 became 1945. Allied forces advanced through France, liberated Paris, crossed into Belgium. German troops withdrew, their supply lines shattered, their morale crumbling. The occupation loosened its grip, not through mercy but through necessity. Hauptmann Richter was reassigned to the Eastern Front in January 1945, replaced by a younger officer who cared less about principle and more about survival. The monthly reporting requirement lapsed, forgotten in the chaos of retreat. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Canadian troops entered Eindhoven, and the occupation ended with it. Dutch flags appeared on houses that had been bare for 5 years, and people who had stayed silent began to speak, to accuse, to settle scores. It was a dangerous time, in some ways more dangerous than the occupation itself, because now the rules were uncertain and anger had no clear target. Anna stayed in her clinic. She treated soldiers, Canadian, British, American, even German prisoners, without distinction, the way her father had taught her. Some of the villagers muttered about this, questioned her loyalty, but no one stopped her. Perhaps they remembered the oath on her wall. Perhaps they simply needed her too much. In June, a letter arrived from England, forwarded through military channels. It was brief, written in careful English on thin paper. "Dear Miss de Vries. I survived the war. I am home now, trying to remember what peace feels like. I wanted you to know that I think of you often, of the risk you took when you had no reason to take it. I told my family about you, about your father's certificate, about the oath you kept when the world demanded you break it, I cannot repay what you did. But I want you to know that it mattered. In a war full of cruelty, you chose mercy. That choice saved my life. It also saved something more, the belief that goodness can exist even in the worst circumstances, *. If you ever visit England, please contact me. I would like to thank you properly, *. Yours gratefully, James Harper." Anna folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, beneath the ledger where she had once recorded false entries to protect her patients. She didn't know if she would ever visit England, if she would ever see James Harper again. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had survived, that her choice had meant something beyond the moment, that the line she had crossed had led somewhere other than destruction. In the months that followed, life in the Netherlands rebuilt itself slowly, painfully, like a bone knitting after a break. Anna continued her work, treating patients, delivering babies, draining infections. The clinic remained open, a constant in a world that had been anything but constant. She never spoke publicly about James Harper, never claimed recognition for what she had done. It was enough to know that she had acted according to the oath she had taken, that she had kept faith with her father's principles even when keeping faith meant risking everything. But some things could not be unlearned. She had learned that safety was an illusion, that choices echoed longer than you expected, that mercy was both simpler and more complicated than she had ever imagined. She had learned that the line between right and wrong was not always clear, but that not choosing was itself a choice, and one that carried its own consequences. Years later, when historians began documenting acts of resistance during the occupation, someone mentioned Anna's name in connection with an Allied airman hidden in a rural clinic. She refused to be interviewed, declined to be honored. "I was a nurse," she said simply. "I did what nurses do." But those who knew her understood that it was more than that. She had been a woman in an impossible situation who had chosen humanity over expedience, risk over safety, conscience over compliance. She had kept an oath when keeping it might have cost her life. And in doing so, she had proven that even in the darkest times, even when the world demanded cruelty, individuals could still choose mercy. That choice, quiet and unwitnessed except by those it directly affected, mattered. It always had. It always would. Decades passed. The war became history, then memory, then something distant and abstract, studied in textbooks by generations who had never known hunger or fear or the sound of boots on gravel at midnight. The world rebuilt itself, became prosperous, forgot. But some stories lingered, carried forward by those who lived them and those who heard them from those who lived them. Anna de Vries never married. She continued working at her father's clinic until 1972, when arthritis in her hands made surgery impossible and age made the long nights unbearable. She retired at 60, turned the clinic over to a younger doctor, and moved into a small house in Eindhoven. She lived quietly, tended a garden, corresponded with former patients who remembered her. She did not consider herself exceptional. But in 1983, a researcher from the Dutch Institute for War Documentation contacted her. They were compiling records of civilians who had aided Allied personnel during the occupation. James Harper had mentioned her in his memoir, published 3 years earlier, and they wanted to verify the account. Anna agreed to speak with them, though she downplayed her role. "I treated a wounded man," she said. "That's all." The researcher, a young woman named Sophie, pressed gently. "But you knew the consequences. Hauptmann Richter questioned you. You could have been executed. Many people could have been executed. Many were. I was fortunate. Fortune isn't the same as courage." Anna looked at Sophie, this earnest young woman who had grown up in a Netherlands free of occupation, and wondered how to explain choices made in a world that no longer existed. "It wasn't courage," she said finally. "It was necessity. I took an oath. My father believed in that oath. I couldn't dishonor his memory by betraying it. But the oath didn't require you to risk your life. No. But if the oath meant anything at all, it had to mean something in the moments when following it was hardest. Otherwise, it was just words." Sophie recorded the interview, transcribed it, filed it in the archives. Anna thought that would be the end of it. But in 1985, the Dutch government awarded her the Resistance Memorial Cross, a decoration given to civilians who had performed acts of resistance during the occupation. The ceremony was small, held in a municipal building in Eindhoven, attended by a handful of officials and a few elderly men and women who had lived through the war. Anna accepted the medal, though she struggled to understand why anyone considered her actions worthy of recognition. "I did what any nurse would do," she said in her brief remarks. "My father taught me that medicine doesn't recognize borders or nationalities. Only suffering and the obligation to relieve it." After the ceremony, an elderly man approached her. He was British, his accent thick, his face lined with age but still recognizable. James Harper. He had come to the Netherlands specifically for this occasion, had written to the government to ensure Anna received recognition. "I had to see you," he said. "To thank you properly." They sat in a cafe, drinking tea that Anna found too weak and James found too strong, and talked about the decades that had passed. James had become an engineer, married, raised 3 children. He had told them about the war, about the clinic in the Dutch countryside, about the nurse who had risked everything for a stranger. "I wanted them to know," he said, "that people like you existed. That not everyone looked away. I couldn't look away. Not without becoming someone I didn't want to be. That's what makes it remarkable. You had a choice. Most people would have chosen differently. Anna shook her head. I don't think so. I think most people, if faced with the same situation, would do the same. We tell ourselves otherwise because it makes the world seem darker than it is. But I believe most people, deep down, want to be good. The war made it harder, but it didn't change that. James didn't argue. They finished their tea, and he left the next day, returning to England and a life that had long since moved beyond the war. Anna returned to her small house, placed the medal in a drawer, and continued her quiet existence. In 1994, as Europe marked the 50th anniversary of liberation, journalists became interested in wartime stories. Anna, now in her 80s, agreed to a single interview with a Dutch newspaper. The article that resulted was brief, respectful, and focused more on her father's legacy than her own actions. But it prompted letters from unexpected sources. One came from a woman in Germany, Greta Hoffmann's niece. She explained that her aunt had died in 1978, still haunted by what she had done. She never forgave herself, the niece wrote. She used to say that fear made her betray a friend, and that no amount of safety was worth that guilt. I wanted you to know that she regretted it until the end. Anna read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it with James Harper's note from 1945. She felt no anger toward Greta, only a deep, tired sadness for the choices the war had forced on all of them. Fear was not a sin. It was human. And humans, when afraid, did not always act nobly. She had been fortunate that her fear had not overwhelmed her principles. Others had not been so fortunate. Another letter came from a medical student at the University of Amsterdam. She was writing a thesis on medical ethics during wartime and wanted to include Anna's story. What you did, the student wrote, demonstrates that the Hippocratic obligation to do no harm can exist even in conditions designed to make compassion impossible. Your actions provide a model for modern discussions about medical neutrality in conflict zones. Anna declined to participate in the thesis. She did not want to be a model or a symbol. She had done what she believed was right, and that was enough. The idea that her actions might be studied, analyzed, turned into academic theory, felt wrong. It reduced something personal and immediate to something abstract and distant. But the letters kept coming, slowly, sporadically, over the years. A grandson of one of her wartime patients, thanking her for saving his grandmother during a difficult childbirth in 1944. A historian researching rural medical care under occupation, asking about the black market pharmacist in Eindhoven. A teacher from a secondary school, requesting permission to include her story in a lesson about moral courage. Anna answered some and ignored others. She was 93 years old, her hands too stiff to write more than a few lines, her memory sharp but her patience for attention worn thin. She had lived long enough to see the war become history, history become legend, and legend become something sanitized and simple, stripped of the fear and doubt and moral ambiguity that had defined every choice. She died in 2003, in her sleep, in the house she had lived in for 3 decades. Her funeral was small, attended by former patients and their children, by colleagues from the medical community, by a representative from the Dutch government who read a brief statement about her contributions during the occupation. James Harper had died 5 years earlier, but his son attended, bringing with him his father's memoir and a letter James had written but never sent, found among his papers after his death. The letter was addressed to Anna and dated 1989. Dear Anna. I have been thinking lately about choices and consequences, about the moments that define us even though we don't recognize their significance at the time. I think about the night I collapsed in your courtyard, barely conscious, and the choice you made to bring me inside instead of closing the door, you could have chosen differently. Any rational person would have. The risk was too great, the reward non-existent. And yet you chose mercy over logic, humanity over survival. I have spent 50 years trying to understand why, and I think I've finally realized that I never will. Some people are simply good in ways that defy explanation, I am grateful to have known you. I am grateful that people like you exist in the world. And I am grateful that I survived to tell my children about the Dutch nurse who taught me that goodness is not impossible, even in the worst circumstances. It is only rare, With enduring gratitude. James. Anna's estate was modest. She left the clinic building to the local medical association, stipulating that it be used for community health services. Her father's certificate, framed and faded, was donated to the Dutch Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, where it hangs today in a small exhibit about medical personnel during the occupation. And the story itself? It survived, passed down through families, documented in archives, mentioned in histories of the occupation. It became one of thousands of stories from the war, small acts of courage or compassion or defiance that collectively formed a counternarrative to the larger story of conquest and collaboration. But what makes Anna de Vries's story distinctive is not that she acted, many people acted, in ways large and small, to resist or survive or simply to maintain their humanity. What makes her story distinctive is that she acted knowing the consequences, understanding the risk, and choosing principle over prudence anyway. She did not have the protection of a resistance network or the authority of a position. She was simply a nurse with an oath and a choice, and she chose to honor the oath even when honoring it might have cost her life. That choice resonates because it forces us to ask ourselves what we would do in her position. It forces us to confront the gap between the values we claim to hold and the actions we would actually take when those values conflict with our safety. Most of us will never face that test. Most of us will live our lives in relative comfort, our principles unthreatened, our choices easy. But Anna's story reminds us that such tests can come unexpectedly, and that when they do, the choice we make defines us more completely than any belief we profess in peacetime. The war ended 80 years ago. The occupation ended 79 years ago. Anna de Vries has been dead for more than 20 years. But the question her life poses remains: when faced with a choice between safety and principle, between survival and conscience, what will we do? She answered with her actions. The rest of us will have to answer with ours. The cellar beneath the clinic in Eindhoven is still there, though the building now houses a community health center. The entrance has been sealed, the space repurposed for storage. But if you know where to look, you can still see the narrow gap in the foundation where air once reached a wounded British airman hiding in the darkness. No plaque marks the spot. No monument commemorates what happened there. Anna de Vries would have wanted it that way. She did not act for recognition. She acted because, in the moment when action was required, she could not do otherwise. That is the quiet legacy of those who chose mercy when the world demanded cruelty. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their deeds are rarely celebrated. But their choices echo forward, reminding us that even in the darkest times, even when the costs are highest, humanity survives in the actions of individuals who refuse to look away. Anna de Vries looked at a wounded enemy and saw a patient. She looked at her oath and saw an obligation. She looked at the consequences and chose to act anyway. In doing so, she proved that conscience is not weakness, that mercy is not naivety, and that principles matter most when upholding them is hardest. The war took much from her. It took her father, her safety, her certainty. But it could not take the one thing she refused to surrender, the belief that some choices are worth making, regardless of their cost. That belief, fragile and defiant, is what separates compassion from convenience. It is what transforms a simple act of medical care into something larger, something that transcends the moment and speaks to the possibility of goodness even when goodness seems impossible. Anna de Vries treated an enemy. She risked arrest, interrogation, execution. She survived. And in surviving, she left behind a quiet proof that individual conscience can endure even when the world demands its surrender. Her story is not triumphant. It does not end with victory or vindication. It ends with an elderly woman in a small house, tending her garden, answering letters, living out her years in the same quiet dignity she showed when she opened her door to a stranger in the rain. That is enough. It has always been enough. The war is over. The choices remain.